Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this is the Telemanker Review. It is 9:46 p.m. It's Friday, the 21st of November. And tonight I want to tell another personal story, like the Ultima Hombre podcast. I like to break them up. I don't like to just keep doing the world and politics or purely spiritual topicality. I like to just, break it up, and I usually start to get a sense, I think, of what I'm going to talk about sometime during the day in flashes here and there. And then I decide what direction I'm going to go in. Some nights I sit down and I don't have any clue. I've already said that a few times, but I don't have any clue, and the podcast just comes out. But this is a story very similar to Ultima Hombre, Last Man Standing. Ultima means last, and hombre is man. So, Ultima Hombre, last man. And when I was growing up, I had different groups of friends that sort of represented, I guess, different parts of myself. I played a lot of sports growing up. I was never big, but I was fairly decent at sports. And I played hockey for about 13 years. And I golfed. I played baseball, or softball was what we played in Canada, at least when I was young. I boxed. That was mainly home training, though. Heavy bag and a speed bag in the basement. But in the Ultima Hombre, in the Last Man Standing podcast, I spoke about my artistic side, and my artistic friends. One I met in the third grade, he was in the fourth, and the other one I met in the seventh grade. And I had other groups of friends, and the thing about my upbringing and my socialization as a child is I had these compartmentalized worlds, and they didn't meet. Like, all my friends knew each other, but they didn't hang out together. And so sometimes I would hang out with my, I guess you'd call it my jock buddies, my sports buddies. And other times I would hang out with my artistic buddies, and the sport buddies, they didn't really have an artistic side. And the artistic buddies, they didn't really have a sports side. And then aside from like the organized sports, the league sports I played growing up, and the golf clubs I went to, public golf courses in the summer, and all the sort of organized sport, I did very, very heavy training in boxing. I was taught how to box around 10 or 11 years old. I was taught how to train by my father. He loved boxing. He had a whole shelf of books in the basement, what we call the recreation room. It's where you had a ping pong table down there. half of it was finished, and the other half of it was my dad's workspace. He had his workbench there and all his tools. And I had a heavy bag and I had a speed bag and I had a spot for jumping rope, because you gotta have good footwork to be a boxer. So I really have these like three personalities as a kid from about 12 to 16. Artistic, league sports, and a bona fide tough kid. Super tough kid. Able to fight very, very well at a young age. By the time I was 15 years old, I could knock an adult man out with one punch. And that was from thousands of hours on a heavy bag, which develops your punching power, your timing, and your placement, and your footwork. And a speed bag, which obviously develops your speed. And so I had kind of like a third group of friends, which I referred to as my thug friends. I was a thug. When I was 12, 13, 14, 15, I was a thug. I mean, I had an almost Al Capone-like power. People were terrified of me. It's strange to say these things aloud at 59 years old. I had a lot of anger, tremendous amount of anger. And anger, according to the philosopher Schopenhauer, is when you have ideals inside you, but they can't find expression in the world. So I already had the heart of a seeker. That's why I gravitated toward meditation at such a young age. I had the heart of a seeker. I had a very, very pure heart. I did not understand why people were so shitty. And my response to that was to be more shitty than them. I know, makes no logic, right? There's no reason to that. It's completely illogical. But that's what you're like when what's going on inside of you is unconscious. I had a horrible home life. Horrible. I mean, I did not like being there. This is going to have more resonance for those of you who have read The Devil in Us. And I cover a lot of this high level very quickly in the first 3 chapters. But I was an incredibly tough kid, and I knew it, which is really bad. And so, like I said, I was like Al Capone. I was smacking people around all the time. Extremely violent. To this day, I still have that violence in my thought stream. And not all the time, but it comes, right? Old memories, old selves resurface. And if I was putting someone I knew in their place, I wouldn't punch them. It was just too devastating. And it would be big trouble, because they'd probably, I don't know, lose some teeth, break a nose, get knocked out, fall back, hit their head, all kinds of stuff. But I would brace people a lot, I would grab them and smack them around a lot. My father I don't think I did the description of him justice in The Devil in Us. In many ways, he was a Joe Pesci character. He's a little guy, even smaller than me. You know, I'm only 5'7", but my dad was only like 5'5". And he was as vicious as those Joe Pesci characters, you know, like Goodfellas and Casino and stuff like that. Just a vicious human being. Sadistic even, I'd say. But I mean, I've covered all this in the book, right? I mean, the man was profoundly spiritually bothered, profoundly bothered man. And no contact with his own feelings at all. Complete and total inability to express himself emotionally. Except in an AA meeting. And the only compassion I ever saw him show was to people who were in a rough situation vis-a-vis alcohol or drugs and had went into the 12-step program and had genuinely hit rock bottom. He was not a soft man at all. If you had anything in your character that he didn't like, he would, in a sense, wish ill upon you. And I guess in his thinking, this was an acceleration of something so that you hit rock bottom and you broke. Because that's what happened to him. And it was very humbling for him. And he found himself most comfortable relating to other men who had been equally humbled by the darkness and the addiction in themselves. And in a sense, he didn't really take seriously anybody who had not been on that journey. He thought they were phonies, to quote Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye. That was a big thing. I heard that a lot, like in the 70s, early 80s. He would be at the dinner table talking about important people in the Canadian government that he regularly met with, and he'd say, oh, that guy's a goddamn fucking phony. He was also, literally, and I'm not exaggerating, the most foul-spoken human being I've ever known. I've never seen anyone even come close in a movie. I'm not joking. My father was a Nobel laureate in the poetry of profanity. And he considered people who didn't express themselves as freely as he did to be goddamn fucking phonies. Now, he bottled that all up when he threw his suit on and went into the office for his job. He's a very smart man, too. Diabolically smart. Excellent memory. I remember just for shits and giggles, when I was about 13 or 14, he went and took a bunch of courses at Carleton University just to exercise his mind. He took a psychology course and some other stuff, just some stuff that interested him. And they were undergraduate courses, and he was in his mid late 30s. No, early 30s. I was 31. He was 31 when I was born. And so if I was 13 or 14 when he was doing this, he would have been about 35 years old, 34, 35. And I remember him coming home with the exams and his final marks. And he got 100% in everything. And it was really kind of impressive. But there was a darkness to his intelligence. And my father was a thug. Okay, he was a thug. Except he didn't work on the street like Joe Pesci. But believe me when I tell you, governments need thugs too. State departments need thugs. You know? John Perkins, the economic hitman, he was a thug. And I was a thug. But I operated on the street, and I didn't beat people up through intimidating their trade representatives in foreign meetings, which is probably what my father did, in a subtle way. Government thuggery is very subtle. It's more of a suggestion than a threat. If you do this, Canada will do this, knowing that it would be devastating for the other country, to their economy. And he loved that shit. He loved the power of it. You know, it's a little bit of a Napoleon complex there, I'm pretty sure. And so I was a thug, but I was a street thug. And I was just smacking people around all the time, open-handed. If they offended me somehow, and I knew them, and if I didn't know them, and it was a chance encounter on the street and a random street fight, then I would punch. And invariably I would knock the people out and walk away. Leave a guy knocked out on a sidewalk. Summer, winter, minus 30 degrees Celsius in July. Just knock him out and walk on my way. One punch. And I got really used to doing that. And now, my thug friends were two people. And both of them I also met around the 4th grade. And they were natural-born thugs. And not by the copious thousands of hours of training like I did at home boxing. So, how much of a thug was I? Well, by the age of about 14, I would travel around with 2 rolls of pennies in my jacket pockets, both of them wrapped in electrical tape. I would go to the bank, I would get 2 rolls of pennies. I would give them $1 and get 2 rolls of pennies. I think there was 50 pennies in a roll. And this creates a weight in your palm. Those of you who know anything about serious street fighting, you know that a roll of pennies in your hand is almost like brass knuckles, except it's not. What it does is it tightens up the bone structure in your hand. And it's like getting hit with a sledgehammer. And if I came across someone on the street who was causing me trouble, and I wasn't necessarily looking for trouble, I had a certain confidence in the way I walked. You know, there was just a way my heels hit the ground and I bounced off my toes when I walked. You could just see us. I can see it anyways. I don't know if you guys can, but I can tell the energy of a person just by how they walk, how much power they have. You can see it in animals too. Look at the way a pit bull walks. You just know that thing is deadly, right? And I walked like that, like a human pit bull. So I was a thug, total thug. And one of my friends I met in the 4th grade, his name was Derek. And he was a natural born thug. Even in the 4th grade, he was huge. And he'd had to have a number of operations. Now, how old are you in the 4th grade? You're 6 years old in the 1st grade, 7 in the 2nd, 8 in the 3rd, 9 in the 4th grade. So by the time he was 9 years old, he'd already had operations for hernias. And the hernias were related to overexertion. Very unusual for a child that age to get a hernia. Very, very unusual. And he'd had 4. And so what the doctors did, because he couldn't have any more hernias, is they put him on a hormone therapy to accelerate puberty. So he by the time he was like 11, in how old are you? 10, 11. That's about the 5th or 6th grade, right? About the 6th grade, you're 11 years old, 12 years old in the 7th grade. By the time he was in the 7th grade, he had a mustache. And he was a physical phenomenon. He wasn't that big. He was only about 5'8", but by the time he was 13, he was 175 pounds, and it was, solid. He had the record at our high school for the 100-yard dash, which is not something a stocky man usually wins, but he did. He was just a freak of nature in every way. His mother had been divorced, and she had remarried a man, Derek's stepfather. I knew him. Huge guy, like 6'5", 270 pounds. And Derek's mom was a schizophrenic. This is my thug friend. Now you understand, my artistic friends never hung around with my thug friends. My compartmentalized life. And so Derek had a lot of pain inside him. He was dropping acid by the time he was 14. And we just thought that was crazy. Nobody did that with him. He made older friends too. He started to hang around with people like 17, 18, but I'm getting ahead of my story. So Derek was just a phenom. And the ultimate backup too. All right? So I'm out there, the little guy, whose hands move so fast you can't see them. And who can knock you out with one punch if he connects, a left or right, doesn't matter. And then you got Derek, who's just like a Tasmanian devil. And almost indestructible. And we were fighting all the time, shaking kids down. It's fucking insane, man. This is like the 5th grade. This starts in like the 5th grade, right? I was a total thug. And I got it all from home, right? And then the third man in the trio was a full-blooded Ojibwa Indian who was living off reserve. His mom had gotten pregnant on the reserve by an Ojibwa man. And then his mum's father, and this fellow's name was Dean, but his nickname was Cobb. Those of you who have read God is an Economist know a lot about Cobb already. And Dean's mother was not allowed to marry the man who impregnated her because Dean's grandfather deemed the man unworthy of marriage. And Dean's grandfather was the chief of one of the most economically prosperous reserves in Canada. For those of you who know anything about the reserve system in Ontario, this is the Whetung, Whetung, the Whetung Indian Reserve I'm talking about. I used to go there in the summers. Throughout my life, I've had natives in my life. Everywhere I go, I meet natives. I even had native friends. They were called Sa-Ren mountain people in Taiwan. And I don't know, I've just always had this affinity with natives. I think it comes from my Tuatha De Danann heritage, my elemental nature, meaning my cosmic identity is elemental. Some of you are Andromedan, Palladian. I'm an elemental. And so I'm very comfortable in nature, barefoot native, so I'm very comfortable in the jungle too. Now, Dean was huge, also huge. The biggest bone structure I've ever seen on a human being. He's about 5'11", thicker than Mike Tyson in his prime, and about 240, 250 pounds, and not fat. And just a wrecking machine. Just unbelievably naturally strong. Not from training in a gym or anything, We'd be walking down the street, and Dean is about 14, 15 years old, and there's two grown men trying to pull something out of a pickup truck, and they can't do it. They can't lift it. The two of them can't lift it. And we would just stop and say, "Okay, Dean, you want to go help them?" And he would just go over to the truck, pick up whatever it was, like a 500-watt generator weighing 250, 300 pounds, pick it up alone, pick up the thing that two grown men in their 20s or 30s couldn't pick up, just pick it up, take it out of the truck and put it on the ground for them and say, "I can't take it any further for you. You should go home and get a dolly." And then we would just keep walking. For shits and giggles, me and Derek and Dean, we used to go out on weeknights, and just for shits and giggles, no other reason, we used to tip cars. That's how strong these guys were. And the three of us would get at the side of a car, pick the whole thing up, and tip it on its side, and then just keep walking. I can't even believe the shit I did when I was a kid. It's just absolutely crazy. Absolutely nuts. And we were always getting into trouble. The teachers and the vice principals, they didn't know what to do with us. And throughout all of this, I have this outrageous talent with language emerging. So we would do things like on our lunch hour, we would go over to the grocery store near our junior high school. So we'd be like 14, grade 8. And we'd grab a shopping cart and we'd bring it back to the school and we'd run it through the schoolyard. And we used to play hit and run with the kids in the playground. You get out of the way or you're going to get hit. I would be in the shopping cart and either Dean or Derek would be pushing it. And we used to bang it into the windows. We broke windows. We did all kinds of crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. And this went on for quite a while. We were best friends. Again, I hung around with Drew and Mike, and they were my friends. And sometimes I get called by them, and hey, you want to come over? You want to go over to Mike's house and listen to some Yes? And I'd say sure. And I'd go hang out with those guys, and I knew those guys from a very young age. So there was the thug in me wasn't visible when I was with them. I wasn't a thug with my sports buddies on my hockey team and stuff like that. I grew up with a lot of them, started playing hockey with them from 4 years old. Very physical sport, hockey. It was full contact when I was growing up. It isn't anymore until you get up to about bantam, which is when you're 15, 16. But when I was growing up, hockey was full contact, and you could get seriously fucked up playing hockey. Break bones, get knocked out, all kinds of stuff. Unbelievably brutal sport, hockey, for a number of reasons. It's the speed you reach on skates, and the fact that it's full contact, and the fact that if you get taken off your feet and you were skating at 25 kilometers an hour, you're going to slide headfirst into the boards. And you have to know how to tuck and curl, or you could crack your head and hurt your back real bad. Very brutal sport. And my father really liked brutality. He saw the world as a very, very brutal place. And he believed it was his duty to make sure his sons could operate and function in a brutal world. And I could. And I became that brutal world. I became that brutal world. Yeah. So when Robert Phoenix said, when I had the internet glitch or the power outage, and I dropped off the podcast with him, and he was doing that astrological reading, and he said Bruce is a scrapper. Yeah, I don't think he realized how right he was. Right? How tough was I? If you didn't know how to fight, I could take 3 people out. If none of the 3 knew how to fight, meaning they didn't have any training at all, no martial arts, no boxing, they weren't raised in a tougher environment than me and started street fighting when they were 8 or 9. If they did not know how to fight, I could take out 2, 3 guys easy, just me. And then I'm rolling with these 2, Tyrannosaurus Rexes, Dean and Derek, who are the scariest thing in the East End of Ottawa in their age group. So I was really, it was like my Goodfellas phase. I was like a mob guy. I was like Pauly Gauthieri or something. People opened doors for me. People did not fuck with me at all. And for good reason, because I was fucking crazy. And I love to fight. Because I was good at it. And you always like to do what you're good at, right? So I kept up my training, the push-ups, the rope skipping, the hitting the heavy bag, the speed bag. And an intense sport like that, boxing, it develops muscle a different way than weightlifting or anything else. It develops a tendon strength that stays with you your whole life. I still have it to this day. I can still, to this day, at 59 years old, I can still probably knock an adult male out with one punch. If I get my timing and my weight shift right? And those things, you got to practice those a little bit. But it never goes away. Once you learn it and you've got your 3,000-4,000 hours of training in, and you've developed all your tendons and everything, it never goes away. It's it's not like that gym muscle that atrophies if you stop going and lifting weights. So there we are, 14 and a half, 15 years old. Now the East End of Ottawa, it became kind of, where I lived, a kind of a rough neighborhood. There was a lot of what we call, well, I'll use the American term, and you'll understand it if you've seen American TV. There were a lot of projects. They were townhouse projects that were, you could get mortgage subsidies from the government if you met a certain wage. Like, it's kind of like at the poverty level. And these houses were garbage. It's like the walls were made of paper. You could hear your neighbors through the walls. I used to visit my friends in their tenement houses. And, but they were all around. Now, I lived on a cul-de-sac that was all single unit homes. And they were all built before all the Ontario housing, the projects went in. And the real estate agents told all of us that bought the single unit homes that there would be none of that, that the entire area being built up would all be single unit homes, and there would be 2 schools built. Well, they weren't lying about the 2 schools, but it turned out that they were both French, So we had to bust a school far away to go to the English school. And then all the housing they built around my parents' house was this project housing where all these poor kids lived. And that's where Derek lived. Now, Dean, the Ojibwa, he lived actually quite well. His father was a super smart guy. His stepdad was a super smart guy. And started up his own computer company and did systems for the federal government. And this is like in the early 80s. It was really kind of remarkable. Dean's stepdad was raised on the Akwesasne Mohawk Reserve, which is probably one of the most dangerous reserves in Canada. And a gangster reserve that specialized in illegal cigarettes. They would sell cigarettes tax-free. And a lot of gangsters, a lot of Mohawks from the Akwesasne Reserve have done federal time, like way higher than the average community per capita, right? You don't go on the Akwesasne Reserve unless you know somebody there. If you're white, even back then, in the 70s and 80s, you'll get the living shit kicked out of you. And Dean's dad was the captain of the Akwesasne lacrosse team and had won a number of strongman competitions. Hand to God, I'm not making any of this stuff up. And Dean's dad, when I was growing up, the Ottawa phone book was about 4.5, maybe 4.5 inches thick. Okay, like a phone book that thick. And Dean's stepdad could rip a phone book in half. You don't get that kind of strength in a gym. Arnold Schwarzenegger probably could not have done that in his prime. Those strongmen in the strongmen competitions, they can do it. But just a straight up weightlifter, it's a kind of freaky strength that you have to have in your bone structure. No amount of exercise or building muscle in a gym can get you to that strength level unless you have the underlying freakish bone structure. And Dean's dad did. And I already told you about Derek's stepdad. And they both had stepdads. I had my biological dad, but he was a thug and a cocksucker. I love him. And my dad, I love him. But he at a certain point, you just don't lie to yourself anymore. That's part of the enlightenment process. you just stop lying to yourself. It's not an excuse to stop loving somebody, but, you know, I kind of have a little bit of contempt for people who lie to themselves. I kind of have a little bit of a contempt for people who don't face the truth of life. You know, they're the kinds of people who have allowed us to get into the economic and political situation we're in now. Now, Derek was banned from coming to my house. My father didn't like him at like 13. He said, you can't hang around with that kid anymore. But I did. I never listened to my dad. Dean was allowed because he played on my hockey team. He was our enforcer. You know, if we were playing a hockey team in a tournament outside our normal league, and there were tough guys on the other team that were beating the shit out of us and spearing and cross-checking when the ref wasn't looking, our coach would just give Dean the nod, and Dean would go out and take care of the guy. And if he ever came back on the ice that game, it was a miracle. And if he did come back on the ice, he didn't pull any shit, because about the scariest thing in the world was being braced on ice skates by that giant fucking Ojibwa. And he was a really good hockey player. He actually was scouted by the NHL later on in his life. And so we ruled the roost. And when I was about 15, there was a guy that moved in to our neighborhood. He moved into some of the project housing. I think he was about 23 at the time. And he was Pakistani. He had been living in the Bronx and had been raised in the Bronx in New York. He had 3 or 4 different black belts. Very, very dangerous dude. And his family in the Bronx had sent him to Ottawa, Canada, to live with relatives because they felt that if he stayed in the Bronx, he was going to die because he was getting into too much trouble. He was in street gangs and, you know, all this sort of stuff. And so this would have been about 1981, right? Right around the time the Warriors movie came out, for those of you who have ever seen it, the Walter Hill movie. And Chico moved into our neighborhood, and he grabbed up all these super tough kids. Not me. But he grabbed up Dean, he grabbed up Derek, and he grabbed up 2 or 3 Jamaican guys I grew up with who were exceptional athletes and really good fighters. And he formed a gang, like about a 6 or 7 person gang. And he basically brought the Bronx model to the East End of Ottawa. And they called themselves the Black Dragons. And they didn't do a whole lot more than just walk around and look tough. But they started looking for things to do. And then they started beefing with other gangs in the area. Now, these would be gangs that would be feeder gangs for the local motorcycle clubs, and the Hells Angels were in Ottawa and stuff like that. This is, if you were in a gang when you were 14, 15, chances are you'd be a prospect for a motorcycle gang by the time you were 21 or 22. Because pretty much every North American city has gangs and this sort of street culture. And then Chico started beating a lot of people up in the neighborhood. He started dating Derek's sister. And so Derek was 15 at the time, and his sister Amber was 13. But as I said, they had a very chaotic home. The mother was schizophrenic, and the father was a heavy drinker, stepfather, the huge guy, 270 pounds. And so this was a very weak family, and Chico, he had that almost like street psychiatrist sensibility for how to manipulate people. So he started sleeping with this 13-year-old girl I'd known my whole life as Derek's little sister. I'd known her since she was 5. At the time, that didn't really strike me as strange, but I didn't lose my virginity till I was 20. And I didn't really understand sexuality. Looking back on it now at 59, it's almost like that shit that Tommy Robbins is talking about going on in some of the English towns, right? With the Pakistani grooming gangs. And the gang went on for about a year. So it started when I just around the time I turned 15. And I was still getting into a lot of trouble. When Dean and Derek joined the gang, I didn't see them as much. And I started spending more time with Mike and Drew, my artistic friends. And I pulled back from the thug life a little bit. I was a little bit scared. I mean, these guys were, they were carrying guns. I mean, Chico had guns. He carried around pistols. The cops picked up on who he was pretty early on. I delivered the Ottawa Citizen, the newspaper, to Chico's house, and I never collected. I gave it to him for free, and one day he said, "Do you know who I am?" I said, "Yeah, I grew up with Dean and Derek. They're in your gang." He goes, "I appreciate the free newspaper." I said, "Okay, yeah, sure." And all the Jamaican guys in his gang, I grew up with them too in the East End of Ottawa. And they were starting, I don't know what exactly they were doing. Dean and Derek started to get a little bit more quiet about what they were doing. I think they entered into some kind of omerty situation in this gang where outsiders weren't allowed to know what was going on. But something must have been going on, because the Gloucester Police, that was the municipality I lived in the East End of Ottawa, they would routinely pick Chico up and beat the living shit out of him. He'd come out of the jail after 2 or 3 days, and his whole face would be black and blue. He didn't seem to mind too much either. And he was kind of psychopathic. And then when the 3 of us turned 16, me, Dean, and Derek, and our fathers didn't know each other. My dad knew Dean's dad because they would talk to each other in the stands at the hockey games, because Dean and I played on the same team. And but my father didn't know Derek's family. But right around the same time, we all got kicked out of our houses at 16. I was the only one who got thrown out to the street. Dean was sent to live with his biological family on the Wetang Indian Reserve. And Derek was sent to live with his biological father about 5 hours away driving in a town called Sarnia that's just south of Detroit at the US-Canada border. And we all got split up. And I never saw Dean or Derek again for about 15 years. And we all got split up. And I went on and I started to develop my artistic side more and spent much more time with my artistic friends, Dean and Drew. Drew and Mike, who I described in the Ultima Hombre podcast. Now, I never knew what happened to Dean or Derek. I didn't have a clue. When we got kicked out, so I was born in 66. I got kicked out when I was 16. So I think I got kicked out of my house around September 10th or 12th which is literally, 2 months after my 16th birthday. So I'm pretty much freshly minted 16. I got kicked out of the house. It was 1982. Derek got sent to another city, and Dean got sent to the reserve, and the reserve was about a 7-hour drive. And I went on with my life. I ended up moving to Toronto, and I described that perfectly in God as an Economist. Everything I talk about in The Devil in Us all happened when I was around 17, turning 18. I saw a poster, Learn How to Meditate in a Laundromat. I made a couple of allusions to life outside of the body, kind of like a Robert C. Monroe thing. I went to the meeting. Now, you imagine the vibration I had. This total thug, kicked out of the house, been street fighting since I was 12, 13 years old. By the time I'm 15, 16, I'm knocking men out on the street, and I'm walking into a meditation group. You should have seen the look on their faces. They did not know what was going on. And neither did I at the time. And I went on and I moved to Toronto, and I got my degree. And I fought a lot in Toronto too as a doorman in a bar. Not a doorman, a waiter, but I accidentally got into the door staff. We had 4 doormen. It wasn't a nightclub. It was like a roadhouse, but it had like a 400-person capacity. And it was in the West End of Toronto, in the neighborhood I described perfectly in God as an Economist. And every once in a while, we'd get groups of guys come in groups of 5, 6, 7 of them, and they'd want to fight. And we only had 4 doormen, and we'd get these huge fights break out. It got to the point where the Toronto police said if we didn't get the violence under control, they were going to have our liquor license taken away. And it got to the point where when the manager or the owner of the bar would call the cops after coming and breaking up fights 2 or 3 times with like 12 or 15 cops, because that's how many it took to break up the fights, they started coming in with the riot shields. It's like fucking insane. But I made the mistake. The doormen were way over their head one night, and I made the mistake of jumping in, and I knocked out 2 guys, cracked some guy's knee so bad he couldn't walk. And the mistake I made there, because nobody in Toronto knew I could fight, and the mistake I made there was letting the doormen know I could fight, so anytime they had a big brouhaha at the door, they would yell and call me. These guys are going to go. Where's Bruce? How many tables? Go get Bruce. And I'm this tiny little guy, 5'7", maybe 165 pounds. All these doormen our doormen were like 240, 250. A couple of them played Canadian football, CFL, which is a feeder league for the NFL. Where's Bruce? And then I started into fighting again in Toronto when I was like 19, 20, knocking people out all the time. I went through a phase in my life where this left hand, which is usually all I ever had to use, and I'm not even left-handed. But when you box, if you know anything about boxing, a lot of your training goes into developing the left hand because it's your lead hand before you drop a power hand. And so you feel the person out with your left, with jabs and stuff, right? It's like a feeler punch. But my left jab was so strong, I could knock people out with a left. So I very rarely ever used my right hand, if ever. And I used to sprain this hand all the time, man, all the time. So the violence kind of followed me to Toronto. I remember a couple times I even showed up for, lectures at university with my face all beat up. And people would go, what happened? I said, oh, there was a fight where I work. And they said, are you a doorman? I said, no, I'm a waiter. Well, why are you fighting? Well, they were overwhelmed. And then I went to Taiwan. And I was there from 92 to 94. I was in university from 88 to 92. Getting out of Ottawa was the best thing I ever did. Getting away from my family was the best thing I ever did. I came back, I met my son's mother. Or had I met her? Yeah, I had just met her yet, but my son wasn't born. And then one day, and I guess this was about 1996 or about 1996, a year before my son was born. I get a phone call. I pick it up. It goes, Boo Boo. And the only person in the world who calls me Boo Boo, from Yogi the Bear, right? The only person in the world who called me Boo Boo was Dean the Ojibwa. I went, Dean? He said, yeah, and his nickname was Cobb. I said, Cobb, is that you? Now, I'm like 28 at this time, and I haven't known anything about what happened to Dean since I was 16, 12 years earlier, or Derek. Never got news from anybody. Once Dean went to the reserve and Derek went to Sarnia, never heard a word about them, and no one I knew what happened to them. I say, what the fuck, man? How did you find me? And Dean says, oh, I looked you up in the database. I work for the government now. So he got a government job. He had no university or college education, but he got a government job because he was, I guess it was a version of DEI back then. He got it because he was Native. And he started out with a special enforcement unit for immigration. And so it's a small team of less than 12 people, but if someone had a warrant out on them and they weren't a Canadian citizen, Dean's team would hunt them down and deport them or bring them into custody for deportation through the immigration system, a lot like ICE is doing right now. So he starts to tell me what he's doing for a living and everything. And I said, man, I'd love to see you. Let's get together for a coffee. He said, sure, man, sure. So we got together a couple weeks later. And big hug. Not too big, because he could literally crush me like a car crushing machine. You know, it's just unbelievably strong. A human bear. And he starts to tell me about what's going on in his life, and he's making good money and everything. And around that time, he was transitioning from the Immigration Enforcement and Apprehension Team and moving over to the Special Investigation Unit for the province of Ontario. So the SIU investigates police. It's not like internal affairs. It doesn't have anything to do with corruption. It was a special force that was created that to investigate serious injury or death related to an encounter with the police, and they covered the entirety of the province of Ontario. So Dean, being full-blooded, he would do all the jobs on the reserve. So if reserve police or Ontario Provincial Police injured or killed a native, they would send Dean, because he's the only one the natives would speak to on the reserves, throughout the reserve system. And he's explaining this to me, and I said, why are you moving from immigration? And he said, oh, I was on the front page of the Globe and Mail. Some reporter had a picture of me throwing a pregnant Nigerian woman through a gypsum wall. I said, Jesus, has your testosterone not abated yet? I mean, I've been meditating about 10 years by this time, right? I'd really calmed down. I read all my poetry and literature. I got into a university program that's really selective and hard to get into. And I've really refined myself. And Dean, too. I asked him about Derek. He said Derek's still out in Sarnia. He's married there. He's got a kid. And he was like, Derek became a one-man gangster. So he got into moving a lot of drugs. And he wasn't affiliated with any gang, any bikers or anything. and he was still like a ferocious human being. He was about 5'8", maybe 5'9", about 320 pounds, and he could do the splits. Like I said, they're just freaks, right? People you think they're making up in movies. I grew up with guys like this. I asked about Derek's sister. You know, I caught up with all the news on the neighborhood from when we all split up at 16, early 16, like first quarter of our 16th year, right? Buddy, don't go in front of the camera. Fucking cats. And Dean's happy to tell me all the news. I tell him I speak Mandarin. He goes, I don't believe you. You know, we're walking down the street after our coffee. I pass by a convenience store. There's an Asian guy I recognize as Chinese behind the cash. I go in and do all my business in Chinese. And Dean goes, fuck, you always were good with language. I remember you winning those public speaking contests in junior high. I said, yeah, I'm going to be a writer, man. I got a journalism degree. I'm working on my first novel. Cut the shit, guys, okay? Just be happy I let you come in here while I'm podcasting. I got the black cat right behind me. This is a sign, actually. So Dean is transitioning from immigration enforcement to, and I mean, he showed me, he had a clipping in his wallet of the Globe and Mail story, which is our national newspaper. It's like the Washington, it's like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times in Canada. He shows me this picture and the stories about the excessive force used in immigration. And Dean's going, oh man, they never get the context right. She had a gun. Right? I don't care if she's pregnant. She's got a 9mm. I got to take care of myself and my team. But they're all dressed in black. They got the Kevlar on, like these black masks. They look like Mexican special forces. And there's Dean, like 270 pounds. I think he went through a steroid phase as well. Yeah, it's just fucking insane. And I asked about, all the people we knew in common. I said, what happened to Amber, Derek's sister? And he said, oh, she lives in Texas now. She's a mess. She's got 4 kids by 4 different men. And this, of course, was the result of being fucked up by Chico when he was the Pakistani gang leader, when he was 23 and she was 13. I felt tremendous sympathy for her. And then I get around to the ultimate question. I said, you ever hear anything about what happened to Chico? Dean says, hand to God, this is a true story. Dean says, funny you should ask. So in this old neighborhood I used to live in, Chico got convicted of a murder. Someone in the community wanted their husband killed, and they paid him $40,000, and Chico killed the guy with a hammer. And then the woman became remorseful and ratted him out. And there was something about Chico's immigration status that he wasn't fully Canadian. I don't know if he had residency. I don't know what was going on there. But this happened the year before Dean found me back in Canada, back from Taiwan, and called me. And he was working for the enforcement immigration team, and part of their work was transporting prisoners to other countries like U.S. Marshals. So Dean ended up being the guy who escorted Chico on an Air Canada flight back to Pakistan to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security Pakistani prison. The very same guy who recruited him into a street gang when he was 14 and a half. You can't make this shit up. I dare you to even try. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this has been the Talamanca Review.